Welcome to the Flexible Philosophy Podcast, where we sit down with leading thinkers to talk about the ways that their ideas can be put into practice. I'm your host, Hamza King, and on this episode, I'll be discussing the weaponization of victimhood with Lilie Chouliaraki, Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science and author of Wronged, the Weaponization of Victimhood. Thank you for being with us, and we hope you enjoy listening. On the 27th of September 2018, Christine Blasey Ford, a professor at Palo Alto University, appeared in front of the US Senate Judiciary Committee to testify against Brett Kavanaugh, who was at the time a nominee for the US Supreme Court, for sexually assaulting her at a high school party they both attended 36 years earlier. Visibly shaken, she went on to describe how Kavanagh pinned her to a bed, groped her, removed her clothes, and covered her mouth as she tried to scream. "It was hard for me to breathe," she told the committee, "and I thought that Brett was going to accidentally kill me." Not long after, Kavanagh submitted a letter to the committee, calling her testimony nothing but a smear and affirming that he would not be intimidated into withdrawing from the process. Despite public outrage towards this trial, Kavanagh was still confirmed to the US Supreme Court by a narrow victory of 50-48, and President Trump was quick to offer his sympathy. "What they put him through, the Democrats, over the last few weeks, it's horrible. If you look at what he's had to endure, horrible. False statements, it doesn't get any worse. But the beautiful thing is, he's in now, and he's going to be there for a long time." The interesting thing about this case is that both sides claim to be the victim. Mrs. Ford claims she is a victim of sexual assault, while Mr. Kavanagh claims he is a victim of a defamatory smear campaign. But are these claims to victimhood equally valid? And how can we adjudicate between the two to determine who the real victim is? Lilie Chouliaraki, Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science, has tackled these questions head-on in her latest book, Wronged, the Weaponization of Victimhood, where she examines the relationship between vulnerability and privilege and draws a distinction between those who are systematically vulnerable to various forms of violence and those who utilize victimhood as a linguistic tool to further their political objectives. Lilie, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Hamza.
Well, Lilie, I always start by asking guests what got them interested in their area of work. I know you've written other books on the ways that the suffering of those in the global south is portrayed by Western media. And of course, in this book, you focus more on the ways that suffering is politicized within Western countries themselves. So what was it that sparked your interest in these topics? And why specifically did you decide to write a book on the ways victimhood has become weaponized?
So my training has been in languages, first of all in classics and then subsequently in linguistics, in social semiotics, discourse analysis and stuff like that. So I always thought that language and image and communication are central to the ways that we talk about human suffering and the ways we're invited to relate to those who suffer. But perhaps one of the first images that sparked this interest in me was even earlier than my university studies. I was a secondary school student in Athens, in Greece, and at a history lesson on a big topic in Greece, obviously the Greek War of Independence in the 19th century. We were shown a painting by Delacroix, scene of the massacre at Chios, which puts you face to face with Greek civilians on the island of Chios, slumped, dead, wounded, and just terrified, desperate. So that was a depiction of the aftermath, so to speak, of the massacre that basically depicted mass suffering and grief. Now, back in 1824, this painting was shown in a major cultural venue in Paris, the Paris Salon. It turned the Greek War of Independence from a kind of marginal conflict in the margins of Europe into a popular humanitarian cause in France and in Europe. So it became a big wave of solidarity for the Greek struggle for independence against the then Ottoman Empire. So to me, that was the 19th century equivalent of a humanitarian campaign today, right? Because it helped transform distant war into a shared concern, moral and political concern, something that people could witness, they could discuss it, and they felt involved in it. So that was maybe the spark of the whole interest, I think, back at school. But the bigger point that I think I got out of this, and I think that became eventually the main driver of my work until now, is that the stories that we tell each other about who suffers, who deserves our compassion, and who doesn't, or whose voices are heard or silenced in that storytelling matter enormously in the media, in our politics, in our societies, and in just what kinds of citizens we are and what we care about. So in my earlier work, for instance, you mentioned a book called The Spectatorship of Suffering, like almost 20 years old now. It examined precisely that, how our news media in the global north tells stories about people suffering in the global south. And a key takeaway from that research was, beyond that point on the power of images, was the point about the power of geopolitics in images and in communication. And the idea that the preferred standpoint from which images invite us to witness the suffering of others is essentially that of a white Christian West, which, historically has centered its own experiences as worth caring for, but also made the suffering of the global South, particularly that of Black and brown people, less visible, less urgent, and less grievable. And now to come to my more recent book where your introductory example comes from, Wrong, the Weaponization of Victimhood, that actually grows directly out of that trajectory I just described, but turns the question of the stories of suffering onto us, onto the West.
Yes.
And it asks instead, how do we tell stories of suffering about ourselves and to ourselves? So the idea of the book came about 10 years ago, and the triggers were the Brexit referendum and Trump's first election to presidency. And unfortunately, it has become even more topical today with Trump's second term in office and the global rise of far-right forces in government or close to becoming governments. And what intrigued me back then was the paradox of very rich, very privileged people disconnected from or indifferent to the daily struggles of working people, just winning elections in the name of the oppressed and of the victims.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's very interesting. Just picking up on this point you're making about the kind of distinctions between the ways that we view different soldiers. I know one of the examples you touched on was Peter Jackson's film They Shall Not Grow Old, right, which relied on archive material from the Imperial War Museum, which meant that the documentary was essentially restricted to British veterans and thereby rendered the lives and experiences of non-white soldiers who, of course, made massive contributions to the war effort voiceless, right? And you argue that this reveals how the kind of emotional capitalism of the 21st century should not only be understood, as a kind of rise of the languages of pain, that people are kind of using these languages more, but that it should be understood as a story of kind of voicing and silencing people. And I think that's what really kind of came out in your discussion just there. It's a dynamic process of power that attaches these languages of pain unequally, right? And because, of course, victimhood is such a central concept in your book, maybe it would be good if we could clarify how the term has been understood throughout human history.
The book is about the history of victimhood in the West, and particularly late modern history. So I look at the concept basically from the end of 19th to throughout 20th century and up to today. But of course, when you talk about victimhood as a concept, you need to go at least momentarily even further back in the history of the West. And what you're finding there is that the figure of the victim has always been changing in meaning to reflect the moral context of its time. So in early Christianity, for instance, the victim came to mean those early Christians whose suffering and death were narrated as testimonies to faith. So in Greek, the word is martyr, and the martyr actually means witness. So the martyr was never at that time just a victim, as in someone who suffered, but it was someone whose suffering was meaningful as a spiritual encounter with God. And so narratives of victimhood as martyrdom in those early days were used to bring together the entire religious community of Christians. And I think we see the use of the concept in different contexts today where martyrdom bears precisely that same political meaning of a suffering that is not in vain. It is done in the name of something bigger.
Yes.
And it brings a community of people together in faith to that bigger cause. Now, with the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, that picture changes, and thinkers like Adam Smith, for example, who I mentioned several times in the book, especially in his seminal study, Theory of Moral Sentiments, framed suffering in a different way. So suffering is no longer about divine sacrifice, but it is about harm done to an individual. And this reframing from a more collectivist and religious view of suffering towards a more secular view matters enormously because it turns victimhood into a personal condition of the individual that calls for compassion and for sympathy in Adam Smith's terminology. Like his theory of moral spectatorship is all about this humanitarian pedagogy of caring for the sufferer. But in parallel, we also have the story of the codification of human rights, in national charters of rights as a means of protection from harm and as a means of legal recognition of the individual as a citizen in the American Declaration for Human Rights, for instance, or in France. And those two mutations, if you like, in the idea of the sufferer as victim, one calling for compassion, the other being attached to human rights, is, I think, the beginning of a broader shift that gave rise to the modern imagination of humanitarianism and human rights. And the book kind of goes fast through kind of those developments and focuses mostly on the 20th century, where we see a further specialization in the language of victimhood, what in the book I describe as the two dominant languages of pain in liberal modernity, trauma and human rights.
Yes. And of course, during the 20th century, as you've kind of discussed, there was a shift towards viewing soldiers, right, as the kind of the central victims. Now, when I read this in your book, I'm not sure if you've seen the film Forrest Gump.
I saw it when it came out first.
Long before I did.
Before you would ever have known about it.
And I was thinking about the image of Lieutenant Dan, right? And so Forrest goes out to Vietnam, and Lieutenant Dan's from a family of soldiers, and he's dedicated his whole life to being, a lieutenant. He takes it very seriously, and he's injured in battle, goes back to America, and he's disabled, a disabled veteran. And the contrast, I think, for me, of seeing this kind of authority figure soldier who's respected and everyone listens to, and then goes back to a society where he is essentially kind of, ostracized and made to feel, ashamed and humiliated by his disability, for example. I think that image really stuck out to me as a central symbol of the sufferer, right? And of course, what's interesting, and we've already kind of touched on this, is that not all soldiers were granted victim status equally in the rest. And even in Forrest Gump, as Forrest's friend, Bubba Gump, who is actually an African-American soldier, and his story, it doesn't end as happily. He ends up being killed in Vietnam, and Forrest kind of honors his legacy by starting a shrimp company. But I think there's an interesting point there about how, these racial, class, gendered intersections can really change the ways that people are remembered, the ways that history is written, which is essentially what you're talking about here. So I think, I know we kind of touched on this, but maybe if you could kind of speak a bit to the ways that privilege and vulnerability seem to kind of intersect here with claims to victimhood.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think your example of Forrest Gump is really very appropriate because I think that film and its success kind of encapsulates so well the kind of dominant imaginary of suffering, privilege, and heroism in contemporary US. And I think by extension also, the West more generally. But maybe before we go into the film, I just wanted to kind of contextualize the historical chapter of the book, where basically I talk about how the 20th century, which is, Hobsbawm's age of catastrophe, the age of 2 world wars, the atomic bomb, the Holocaust, the soldier, particularly the male soldier, became the central figure of victimhood. So that's a chapter about the development of late modern masculinities as much as suffering and vulnerability.
Yeah.
But the particular kind of soldier that is being singled out, narrated, and commemorated is ultimately the white Western male soldier traumatized by war and struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. So in that sense, Lieutenant Dan is the quintessential figure here. So what we have with him in the film is a representation of a white veteran in a wheelchair. The sacrifice is kind of honored symbolically, but who is also abandoned and humiliated and made to feel less than normal when he returns from Vietnam. So with his storyline in the movie, we see both the costs of war in terms of someone who is vulnerable to its violence, both the physical and the psychological aftermath of that. But we also see a white national who is able to voice his victimhood, right? To speak out in anger, to kind of communicate his trauma and injury, despite the fact that, that the state is unresponsive, insensitive, doesn't care. And within the film, we ultimately see a narrative arc around that character that speaks of acknowledgement, of recovery, of social recognition, right? He appears settled, he is engaged, he's more
Married at the end.
gets married. Yeah, exactly. He's more secure financially as well. So we see a happy arc. I think the distinction between him and the African American soldier killed in, yes, exactly, killed in Vietnam, it tells the story of my chapter as well, because crucially, not all soldiers have been experiencing war and its aftermath in the same way as Lieutenant Dan. And this point is one of the key points of that chapter, because while all soldiers, of course, are vulnerable to the catastrophic violence of the battlefield, Black and brown soldiers, particularly in wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries, were not worthy of commemoration at all. Black soldiers fighting in the American Civil War, Indian and African troops in the British Army of the First World War, Black soldiers in the segregated U.S. Army units of the Second World War, or even non-Western allies in the so-called War on Terror just a few years ago in Afghanistan. All of those are far less visible, hardly commemorated in mainstream liberal memory. And this asymmetry brings us back to our earlier discussion, I think, on power, victimhood, and vulnerability. And in my own argument, the 20th century white soldier is certainly a tragic sufferer. I mean, everyone who fought industrial wars of that century is a victim of horrific violence. But the problem is that he is turned into a universal victim. And that at the same time, other parallel stories and trajectories of war violence and death that impacted other populations, even worse, are silenced and erased from official memory. And my point is that these liberal narratives of war reflect already existing, as you put it, already existing racialized and gender hierarchies of suffering, where those soldiers who already possess the national racial privilege to be recognized and to be heard are more likely to have their suffering commemorated and narrated. And others who are equally or even more exposed to harm remain background figures in the story of Western war pain.
Yeah, and I think kind of drawing gender back into this here, one of the interesting things about this is that the kind of image of suffering for females was taken from the framework of soldiers, right? So that PTSD framework was the framework used to then explain, for example, the experiences of women during domestic violence. So we can already see how it actually has practical significance, because these universal images of suffering then become the dominant way of understanding other forms of suffering. And kind of keeping on this theme of gender now, because we've spoken quite a bit about the historical side and maybe moving towards more contemporary issues around victimhood. You said earlier that your book was published in 2024, the same year that Trump was re-elected into the presidential office, and a year which saw populist leadership flourish around the world. Now, one of the arguments you put forward is that victimhood has been reversed by authoritarian populists like Trump, who use it as a linguistic tool to further their political objectives. One of the examples that you point to was the overturning of Roe versus Wade in June 2022. And, I think I'll just leave you here to maybe explain how you think reverse victimhood might have played a role here, and how it might, more broadly be playing a role in Trump and other far-right leaders, their kind of politics.
Yeah. Absolutely. So when I talk about reverse victimhood, that really just simply refers to a rhetorical move in which powerful actors present themselves, or the groups they favor, as the real victims, even when they're the ones largely sheltered from most forms of structural violence. So it's a way of kind of flipping or reversing moral roles, so that responsibility and accountability is taken away from these actors, even though other more vulnerable parties are harmed in the process. And like you said, a good illustration of that is the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court in the US in June 2022. So in the book, I explain how this decision was actually a triumph of essentially evangelical movements and far-right politicians that, after a long struggle, eventually managed to roll back women's reproductive rights and turn their constitutional right to abortion into a matter of the political will of each federal state. So basically endangering millions of women across states. And in fact, we have seen statistics showing how the rate of death, especially Black women's death, has risen to a number of states precisely as a direct consequence of the imposition of those severe restrictions on or complete bans to abortion in those states. So where does reverse victimhood come into this? So at the heart of this win was the Supreme Court's framing of the fetus as a suffering person. So the fetus was not seen as a person before 2022. But Trump's Supreme Court endowed the fetus with legal personhood for the first time and portrayed women seeking abortions as perpetrators of violence against that fictional person, quote unquote. So women who lost, their fundamental right of sovereignty over their bodies are now cast as murderers, and that imaginary figure, the fetus, is cast as their victim. And that's the sense of reverse victimhood. The group whose rights are being eroded is painted as the danger, while those restricting those rights claim the moral high ground, right? And so backrolling women's rights becomes a noble cause of saving innocent lives in the evangelical discourse. And I think it is quite telling that with the currency of human rights as a profitable in kind of cultural and political capital terms, the currency of that language in public discourse after the mid-20th century and into the late part of the century and our times now in the 21st, we see the evangelical far right abandoning the religious discourse of the sin. It's a sin to have an abortion, and jumping onto that bandwagon of human rights and appropriating it for their own purposes, turning, as I said, the backrolling of human rights for women into a noble cause for the right of an innocent fetus. So it's quite a sinister political move that is based exactly on that rhetorical trope of reverse victimhood.
Yeah, and I think the term weaponization of the harm principle, I've heard this thrown around a few times here. And, it's interesting that in this attempt to kind of, endow the fetus with personhood, you're almost taking, Mill's harm principle, which is meant to be used to kind of provide liberty, and you're using it in a way that's weaponized. You're using it in a way of putting people down, if you will, to put it in kind of more colloquial terms. And it's interesting, yeah. Right, what would you say to that? Sorry, maybe because I know we've not got this on script, but I mean, in terms of this idea that, Mill's harm principle being weaponized, is this kind of what you're saying? Do you think that this represents your views in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's really important to bring into the discussion at this point is a major distinction that I make in the book, which is a distinction between a vulnerability and victimhood.
Yes.
Because the whole thing about reversal only makes sense if we start looking at how these terms are used against the background of the social field. The social field as a field of social hierarchies, pre-existing social relations of inequality, of privilege, of marginalizations, of exclusions. So it's only within that, richly textured social field of already existing relations that we can then talk about what kind of harm is produced by weaponizing words like victimhood. And so the distinction between vulnerability and victimhood makes sense in this broader frame. So vulnerability is about social space and social positioning. It is the structural condition where people find themselves in, or you're born into your structural conditions, and you try to struggle within those conditions, either to remain there and survive, or through social mobility to reach a better place. So when we are asking questions about vulnerability, it is important that we ask the fundamental question of how sheltered from or how exposed to violence does this particular position leave those who claim to be victims, right? And when I talk about exposure to violence, I mean, how is the person who claims victimhood, how open are they to the violence of gender, of race, of class, or, other forms of inequality and oppression? And we all stand somewhere at that intersection between total exposure to violence, depending on who we are as women, in terms of our sexuality, our race, our class position, our age, our abilities, etc., etc. So we all stand somewhere at that intersection between total exposure and total protection from most forms of violence. So an intersection, if you like, of vulnerabilities and privileges, where if we can imagine that as a continuum, right? On the one hand, we may have the super rich with all the capital in the world to armor themselves with wealth, with access to political authority, with, the privileges of legitimacy, of believability, of everything. And on the other hand, I don't know. I mean, I suppose the new humanitarian category, wounded child, no surviving family, right? Which was established just recently by MSF for orphan children in Gaza during the ongoing genocide. So that's the continuum between, privilege and vulnerability that delineates the space of openness to structural violence that we are all kind of moving in. And I think it's important to keep that space in mind when we then ask questions about victimhood. Victimhood is not an existential condition. It's not a social positioning. Victimhood is a speech act. It's something that I use to communicate my identity. It's a public declaration. I am wrong. I've been victimized, right? And so because it's a speech act, because it's something we use to communicate, anyone can use claims to victimhood, regardless of whether they are in fact structurally vulnerable and open to most forms of violence or not, right? And as I've tried to say earlier, the link between vulnerability and victimhood is actually conditioned by power. So those who are largely sheltered from violence can claim victimhood without being vulnerable, but because they have the means to be widely heard and, authorized and believed, they dominate the public space of our collective conversations. But those who are structurally exposed to violence often lack the voice. They lack the authority or the believability or simply the access to platforms to have their victimhood recognized. And this is why structurally vulnerable groups often need mass movements. So they need to come together to kind of join voices for their claims to victimhood to finally enter public space and gain some form of visibility and authority and maybe legitimacy. BLM or Me Too, for instance, earlier in the century, further back, the civil rights movements, worker strikes and struggles, all of these have been mass movements precisely because there has been structural vulnerability that prevented whole social groups to voice their victimhood, their claim to being harmed in a way that could pass the threshold of visibility and credibility in the public sphere.
It's really reminding me of some of the points Sam Friedman made. We had him on episode 5, and we started with Pierre Bourdieu's idea of society as a social space, right? And the reason I say this is because I think one of the knee-jerk responses people might have is to say, okay, well, why can we not look at Kavanagh and others and say, well, they're equally claims to victimhood, right? What about some movements within, more left? Could we not say there's also reverse victimhood there? And I think the point you're making really highlights that we're starting from the social structures with vulnerability. We're starting from the society where you're situated based on your stocks of social, cultural, and economic capital. And that place in society makes you more or less vulnerable to various forms of violence. And that's the kind of way we seem to be able to decipher between, drawing back to what we said at the beginning, valid and invalid claims to victimhood. And then we have victimhood, which you say is a speech act, which is maybe disconnected from those social structures because anyone in that social space can claim victimhood. And by doing that, based on, their power, their capital, they're able to kind of have that made more salient to others, right?
Precisely.
Yeah, that was really, really interesting kind of seeing the connections there because, Sam Friedman was talking about it specifically related to class, but you can see how the same kind of ideas seem to be relevant there. Moving things now to some of the ways you feel victimhood can be reclaimed by those who are truly deserving. So say we've established why there's a distinction between Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh. How can we now move forward to see how you introduce a critical method for evaluating these claims of reverse victimhood, which is the heuristics of victimhood, which involves kind of interrogating these public claims to pain to make hierarchies of victimhood legitimate in the first place? I think I probably should pass back over to you here to maybe say a bit more about how you think those true victims can kind of reclaim their victimhood.
Yeah, I think maybe one thing to say here, and I think it's kind of worth keeping in mind, is that one reason why victimhood works so powerfully in public conversations is because we tend to treat the victim as a deep and a stable identity, something that resides in us. We carry our traumas, right? They're written in our souls. And, I'm not denying, there is a whole discourse of therapy, a whole culture of therapy that we live in now that actually instills that into us. And I'm not denying that, of course, as individuals and collectively, we can genuinely feel that way. I feel that way very often. But I think
the points.
we all do. Yeah, exactly. It's just the way in which we are constituted as social subjects, as identities in our times. And that's the importance, of the languages of pain and victimhood that I narrate in the book. But I think what you mentioned, the framework that I put forward, it's really just a list of questions that we all ask routinely. I'm just codifying them, kind of putting them together in a more systematic way so that we can follow them kind of more consciously in our everyday encounters with such claims to victimhood. This framework basically reminds us that the voices of victims that we often hear might actually not be voices of vulnerability who seek support, compassion, solidarity, but they may be voices of power, or precisely, as we just discussed, weaponize victimhood to seek more power and domination. And that has nothing to do with how those voices actually feel, but it has to do with social space. It has to do with which position of power they speak from, and therefore how their claims function as acts of power, speech acts of power within that broader communicative environment where they take place, right? And we're going to go back to the Blasey Ford and Kavanagh example to kind of show precisely how that plays out as an act of power that dresses itself as victimhood in a minute. But what I wanted to do first is just to say the heuristics framework, just to demystify it, as I said, is just a cluster of questions that basically asks, who is claiming victimhood, from what position of power, and with what forms of capital? In other words, what kinds of capital do those who claim victimhood own? Economic, symbolic, cultural, military? And what kinds of access, credibility, and authority do these forms of capital grant them? What do these forms of capital protect claimants from? And also, what kinds of violence are those without certain forms of capital exposed to?
Yeah.
It's about asking the question of positionality and capital. And the second cluster is about emotions and community. So what kinds of emotions and what political communities does this claim mobilize? And who is left out? So every claim to victimhood calls up a we, right? A community of identification. I or we have been victimized. Those who are in solidarity with us belong to our community. Those who are not, they are them. They are opposite. They are an enemy often. And that's exactly the political function of victimhood, right? To create communities of affect and belonging between us and them. And of course, part of those two clusters of questions is the bigger question of power and exclusion, right? Whose vulnerability becomes visible in the process and whose remains invisible and excluded. And I think that takes us full circle back to the discussion we just had about the distinction between the two. So it's about really, the heuristics is about those two sets of questions on who and what capitals who claims victimhood carries, the communities and emotions that come with it, who is excluded, who remains invisible, and where those positions stand in society.
Thank you, Lilie. Well, we started by looking at the case between Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh and trying to kind of link this back now. Could we maybe talk a little bit about how these clusters of questions, which you've just, identified, how this, heuristics of victimhood could be applied to the Ford-Blasey case and how this could help us maybe shed light on who is the more valid victim in this case?
Yeah, I think when I was watching that standoff, when it was played out, I think I was also drawn into this idea of who is the real victim, who really suffers. But I think the more I kind of developed the argument of the book, I kind of realized that this question of truth and reality cannot really get us anywhere meaningful because each party may indeed feel its pain as real. I think they both did. And who are we to deny their experience? So I don't think that questions about reality and real feeling get us anywhere. I think what the heuristic helps us do is that it helps us reframe that whole standoff as an unequal struggle between claims to pain. So we focus more on power and structural inequality. And then we see how those claims operate to either challenge or reproduce existing hierarchies and inequalities in the social space. So if we look at Blasey Ford, she speaks from a position marked by systemic gendered vulnerability. Right. And I don't know if we need to kind of remind people of the case, but basically she claimed to have been almost raped. There was an attempted rape at a party when she was a teenage girl, still at school. And she was also in a position of systemic gendered vulnerability. Later, as she testified, that Senate committee on Kavanagh's candidacy as a member of the Supreme Court, as a woman basically testifying about sexual assault in a setting that is historically hostile to such testimonies and vis-a-vis a public ready to doubt a women's claims to pain. So I would say that Blasey Ford's performance was anchored in a long history of women's experiences being dismissed or disbelieved. And I think that's what really also kind of drew and mobilized communities of Me Too solidarity at that point, right, around her, speaking about precisely those structural injustices that all women had faced before Blasey Ford. And then on the other side, we have Kavanagh, who by contrast comes from a position of institutional privilege and male entitlement. So both institutionally and by virtue of his gender, he enjoys so much more privilege. He's basically more sheltered by structural forms of violence than Blasey Ford would ever be, even though she is herself someone who stands at the intersection of many privileges and vulnerabilities in the continuum of privilege and victimhood that we discussed earlier. So Kavanagh frames himself as the victim of smears and reputational destruction. And in so doing, most of us remember his performance, tearing up and then outraged as he was speaking out in that committee. And so he managed to mobilize collective outrage online in favor of, an already super powerful man who was supposedly wronged at the pinnacle of his career. Yet in actual terms, he lost absolutely nothing. He was confirmed to the Supreme Court. And later he sat on the court that helped roll back women's reproductive rights, right? Roe versus Wade, we just discussed. And, in my view, this is a clear instance of reverse victimhood, where he mobilized the languages of pain tactically to protect his already very privileged position and to cast doubt on a historically vulnerable witness who has now receded into invisibility and has in fact been multiply threatened online. She has received multiple death.
She's spoken about it, yeah.
She's spoken about it several times. So you can see that the heuristic, asking the questions of power is not a courtroom verdict. What it does, it kind of invites a productive suspicion towards claims to victimhood and gives us a set of questions that I think we all instinctively apply in different cases in our everyday lives to systematically question claims to victimhood that appear in public life and may be misleading and may be used at the service of power and domination, as I said.
Well, Lilie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've really, really enjoyed reading and discussing your book. I think it's so timely and relevant.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this wonderful conversation.
If you're interested in the deeper philosophical questions around the weaponization of victimhood, subscribe to our newsletter for an extended interview, where Lilie and I discuss the spectatorship of suffering and the ways that we depict the suffering of those in the global south.